Welcome to Hard Script.
The night they laughed, it wasn't at a bar or a party. It was our living room. The same couch I paid to have reupholstered because Emily said the color set the tone for gatherings. The same coffee table cleared like a stage. Her friends were there, shoes off, wine poured, music low enough to sound intentional. Emily stood near the window, smiling the way she does when she's hosting, when the room belongs to her. I stayed in my chair. That's what I do. I sit, I listen, I track what matters. It's how I run supply lines and deadlines. You don't interrupt a process midstream. Someone joked about how men need structure. Someone else laughed and said rules keep things smooth. Emily turned it into a game. She started laying them out, not reading from a list, just shaping the air with her hands. What I should show up to. How late was acceptable. Which weekends were hers to book without checking. What jokes were off limits. How I should handle myself when Jack dropped by from his bar and everyone got loud. They laughed because it sounded light. Because I didn't interrupt. Because silence looks like consent when people want it to. I noticed Jack leaning against the kitchen island. Easy, familiar. The safe guy everyone trusted with keys and favors. He caught Emily's eye once, just long enough to register. The room didn't see it. I did. When the laughter peaked, I stood up. Not fast. Not dramatic. I didn't raise my voice. I waited until the sound thinned, and then I spoke once. I said I had one rule of my own. I said I wouldn't participate in rooms where my presence was treated like a privilege to be managed. I said I was stepping out of the circle. No arguments. No explanations. Effective immediately. The quiet wasn't awkward at first. It was confused. Smiles froze. Someone tried to fill the space with a joke, but it fell flat. Emily's smile stayed in place for a beat too long, then slipped. Her eyes searched faces, not mine. I grabbed my jacket. I nodded to no one in particular. As I opened the door, I felt it settle. Not anger. Not relief. Control shifting. Behind me, the room stayed quiet. And for the first time that night, Emily didn't look in charge. I didn't go far that night. I drove until the noise drained out of my head and stopped where no one from our circle ever went. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere unclaimed. I didn't turn my phone off. I just didn't answer it. By morning, the messages had stacked neatly. Emily's name repeating, switching tone without switching words. First confusion, then irritation, then concern that felt rehearsed. I didn't open them. I've learned that information loses value when you rush it. What I did answer was a call from Mark. He works in procurement at a sister company. Not a friend, not an enemy. Just a man who notices patterns because it's his job. He didn't ask where I'd gone. He didn't mention the night before. He said he'd run into Jack while closing out a vendor issue tied to a private event. Mark said Jack talked too much. About access. About how being trusted makes everything easier. About how Emily was good at smoothing things over when logistics got complicated. Mark didn't accuse. He didn't speculate. He just repeated what was said, exactly as it landed. I thanked him and ended the call. No reaction. No spike. Just alignment. The pieces didn't click. They slid into place, like they'd been waiting. I started paying attention to what I already had. Shared accounts. Patterns and expenses tied to nights I'd been told ran long. Messages that stopped just short of being obvious, written to sound harmless if seen out of context. The kind of caution people use when they think they're smarter than the system around them. I didn't confront anyone. That would have pulled me back into the room I'd already left. Instead, I adjusted my position. I moved money quietly. I rerouted responsibilities. I made sure my work calendar stopped overlapping with social obligations that weren't mine anymore. Emily noticed the changes, not the reason. She asked why I was distant. Why I wasn't checking in. Why I seemed different. I let the questions hang. Answers would have implied negotiation. The shift wasn't loud. It was procedural. I was stepping into the version of myself that doesn't explain delays, just delivers outcomes. By the time Emily realized something had changed beneath her feet, the structure she relied on had already been rearranged. And Jack was still smiling. That told me everything about how safe he thought he was. I didn't become a detective. I became consistent. That's how you see what people assume is invisible. I handled my days the same way I always had, but with tighter margins. I noticed which expenses repeated and which ones shifted when Emily said an event ran long. I noticed how Jack's bar showed up in places it didn't need to. Not charges that screamed. Charges that blended. Small enough to be ignored. regular enough to matter. Emily kept performing normal. She talked about clients and plans and how exhausting it was to manage people's expectations. She moved through the house like nothing had changed, like the ground under us wasn't being quietly regraded. She asked fewer questions now, watching instead. Control doesn't like uncertainty, but it hates exposure more. What she didn't notice was how I adjusted my expressions. I stopped filling silence. I stopped offering reassurance. I stopped smoothing over moments that used to make her uneasy. When she talked, I listened without reacting. When she paused, I didn't rush to help her land the thought. Jack kept showing up. He brought jokes and familiarity and the confidence of someone who thought the rules didn't apply to him. He acted like access was permanent, like being inside the circle made him untouchable. I let him believe that. I forwarded nothing, saved nothing in obvious places. I didn't screenshot conversations or build a case that needed explaining. I documented patterns the same way I do on a job site. Quietly, chronologically, without emotion attached. Emily tested the edges. She suggested dinners. She floated the idea of trips. She mentioned how people had noticed I'd been absent lately. I acknowledged without committing. Engagement would have implied concern. Concern would have put me back on her board. The house felt different, but not tense. Just less occupied. I started staying elsewhere without announcing it. I came and went without syncing schedules. I removed myself from the rhythm she controlled and replaced it with one she couldn't predict. That's when the small things started slipping. She missed a payment window. She double-booked herself and blamed someone else. Jack showed irritation once, then covered it with humor. The cracks weren't dramatic. They were operational. By the time Emily realized she couldn't account for my movements anymore, the version of me she managed had already been shut down, and she still didn't know why. The disappearance wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. It started with absence, not drama. I stopped sleeping at the house altogether. Not suddenly, not in a way that invited confrontation. I removed my things in phases, the same way you shut down a site without halting the entire operation. Essentials first, then items that only mattered because someone else expected them to be there. Emily noticed in fragments. A missing jacket. Tools gone from the garage. The spare charger I used to leave plugged in. She asked where I was staying. I told her I was handling work. Which was true, just not the part she was used to tracking. I rerouted my finances quietly. Joint cards stopped working without warning. Automatic transfers ended without explanation. Bills she'd never touched before became visible to her for the first time. Not as punishment, as exposure. She called more often. The tone shifted again. Confusion slid into urgency. She tried to anchor me with logistics, asking about practical things we used to manage together. I answered selectively. Enough to stay factual, not enough to restore rhythm. I watched from the outside, not through cameras or secondhand gossip, but through the gaps she didn't realize she'd created. Her calendar loosened. Commitments overlapped. People who relied on her started adjusting without telling her first. That's what happens when someone who controls flow loses access to a key route. Jack didn't disappear. He leaned in. He showed up more. He tried to stabilize what he thought was a temporary imbalance. That told me he didn't understand what kind of change he was standing in. Emily's messages stopped being about me and started being about us. About perception. About how it looked. About how people were asking questions she couldn't answer. I didn't correct her. Silence does that work better. One evening, I saw her across the room at a mutual gathering I no longer attended. I wasn't supposed to be there, and she didn't see me. She was scanning faces, checking reactions, recalibrating. The smile was still there, but it didn't land the same way. That's when it settled. I wasn't missing. I was absent by design. And for the first time, she understood that whatever this was, it wasn't a phase she could manage her way out of. Jack's confidence started to work against him. Men like him mistake familiarity for insulation. They think being liked is the same as being protected. I didn't approach him directly. That would have pulled me into a story he could spin. Instead, I adjusted the environment he relied on. The bar ran on relationships as much as cash. Suppliers, permits, informal agreements that only worked because people trusted him to stay easy. I knew where to apply pressure because it's what I do for a living. You don't push where something is strongest. You tap the seams where no one's looking. I made a call to a compliance consultant I'd worked with on a past project. Framed it as a favor. Asked a few neutral questions about local licensing processes tied to event venues. Nothing accusatory. just curiosity presented by someone with a reputation for precision. Information travels faster than intent. Within days, Jack was distracted. He missed a delivery window. He snapped at a vendor he usually charmed. He started showing up late, then overcompensating with forced energy. The bar didn't falter publicly, but the ease around it changed. Emily noticed that before she noticed anything else. She mentioned Jack in passing, irritation creeping into her tone. She said he was stressed. She said managing him was becoming work. She said people were starting to talk. I didn't respond. Her words weren't meant for me anymore. They were rehearsals for conversations she hadn't had yet. The circle felt it next. Invitations shifted. One event quietly moved locations. Another got postponed. People asked questions no one wanted to answer directly. Jack tried to laugh it off, but laughter only works when others carry it with you. I stayed out of sight. I wasn't hiding. I just wasn't available. That distinction matters. Emily's messages changed again. Less emotional, more strategic. She asked what I wanted. She asked how to fix this. She asked whether I'd heard the rumors. I let the questions sit unanswered long enough to make them echo. Jack started calling her more. That was obvious from the way her phone never stopped lighting up. Safety turns into dependency faster than people expect. By the time Jack realized something had shifted against him, he was already reacting instead of steering. Structures don't collapse loudly when they're weakened correctly. They just stop responding. And Emily was beginning to understand that whatever shield she thought she had built inside our circle was dissolving without anyone naming it, including me. The social shift didn't announce itself. It showed up in omissions. Emily started mentioning names I hadn't heard in a while, then stopped mentioning them altogether. People she used to rely on for energy and validation were suddenly busy. Plans that once revolved around her began forming without her input. Not out of malice, out of adjustment. I heard about it through neutral channels. A coworker's spouse mentioned a dinner that felt smaller. A mutual acquaintance commented that Jack's bar had lost its usual rhythm. No one connected the dots out loud. They didn't need to. Absence has a way of doing that work for you. Emily tried to correct course by tightening her grip. She reached out more aggressively, pushing gatherings, forcing check-ins, over-explaining things no one had questioned yet. Control, when it's slipping, becomes visible. That visibility made people uncomfortable. One evening, she showed up somewhere expecting the usual reception and didn't get it. I wasn't there, but I didn't need to be. Someone made a remark about how things felt different lately. Someone else asked, not unkindly, whether everything was okay at home. The question landed too close to the truth to be ignored. Jack wasn't beside her that night. That mattered. When he did arrive later, the room didn't open for him the way it used to. Familiarity had turned into something cautious. People watched instead of leaned in. Emily's smile held, but it didn't travel. She started scanning reactions again, adjusting her posture, recalibrating tone. That used to work. This time, it didn't reset the room. I stayed away from all of it. I didn't need proximity to apply pressure. Distance was doing more than presence ever could. The circle wasn't rejecting her. It was reorganizing without her at the center. Her messages to me took on a new edge. Less confident, less scripted. She stopped asking what I wanted and started asking what I needed. She framed things as misunderstandings. She mentioned how hard it was to manage everyone lately. She said she missed how grounded things used to feel. I didn't respond. That was the moment she realized the problem wasn't Jack. It wasn't rumors. It wasn't stress. It was that I had removed myself from the structure that gave her leverage. And without that leverage, the room she once commanded no longer adjusted to her presence. It adjusted to my absence instead. Emily's isolation didn't arrive all at once. It settled in layers. She started spending more time at home, not because she wanted to, but because there was nowhere else that felt stable. The phone still rang, but conversations ended faster. Messages came back shorter. Plans stayed tentative. The circle hadn't closed on her. It had widened without her position clearly marked. Jack tried to fill the gap. He showed up with solutions that felt like noise. He talked too much, offered reassurance she didn't ask for, made promises that sounded rushed. The more he leaned in, the more exposed he became. People notice desperation even when they pretend not to. I was close enough to see the shift without being pulled into it. Not physically present, not emotionally available. I moved through my days with clean lines. Work stayed contained. Evenings stayed quiet. I didn't check her social feeds. I didn't ask mutual contacts for updates. Anything I learned came to me on its own. Emily reached out again, softer this time. Not asking for answers. Asking for presence. She framed it as concern for me. She said she wanted to understand what had changed. She said she felt like she was losing her footing. I didn't meet her where she expected. I acknowledged the message without stepping into it. A response without engagement. Enough to confirm I existed. Not enough to reassure her. That's when the isolation sharpened. She stopped performing for an audience and started pacing the edges of her own routines. Her events lost their polish. Her confidence slipped in places she couldn't rehearse away. People responded politely, then distanced themselves again. Jack's world narrowed too. The bar stayed open, but the conversations around it thinned. Fewer favors. More formalities. He'd built his position on being everyone's easy option. Once that shifted, he had nothing underneath it. Emily noticed I wasn't reacting to any of it. No messages asking for explanations. No confrontations. No attempts to reclaim space. That absence became louder than anything I could have said. One evening, she saw me across a parking lot, speaking with someone else, relaxed, unhurried. I didn't see her at first. When I did, I didn't change course. I didn't acknowledge the moment beyond a nod. Her face told me everything. Not anger. Not accusation. Recognition. She understood then that I wasn't withdrawing to provoke a response. I had already moved into a position where her reach didn't extend, and she was standing alone inside a structure that no longer responded to her touch. The confrontation didn't happen the way she'd rehearsed it. There was no dramatic arrival, no raised voices, no audience to anchor her. It happened in a place that offered no leverage. Neutral ground. No history to lean on. She waited until she knew I'd be there. Not because she tracked me, but because she'd learned my patterns again the hard way. When she approached, she didn't touch me. That alone told me how far things had shifted. She started carefully, not accusing, not defensive. She said she needed to understand what was happening. She said the silence was worse than a fight. She said she felt shut out of a life she thought she was still part of. I listened without interrupting. I didn't fill the space when she paused. I didn't offer cues. That made her words stretch longer than she intended. People reveal more when they don't get feedback. She referenced the night with her friends without naming it. She framed it as a misunderstanding that had spiraled. She said Jack had been a mistake in judgment, not something that threatened us. She spoke like someone managing damage, not confessing. I didn't correct her version. I didn't confirm it either. When she finally stopped, she waited. That pause used to belong to me when I rushed in to stabilize things. This time, I let it sit until she shifted uncomfortably. I told her I wasn't angry. I told her I wasn't confused. I told her I had stepped away because the role she had assigned me no longer matched how I chose to live. I didn't mention betrayal. I didn't mention Jack. I didn't need to. She asked what that meant for us. She asked whether there was anything she could do to fix it. The questions came faster now, losing structure. I said very little. I said I had already made changes that weren't reversible. I said I wasn't interested in negotiating my place in any room. I said if there was going to be any future conversation, it wouldn't happen under pressure. That was it. She looked at me like she was seeing a stranger who knew her too well. The familiarity she relied on wasn't there anymore. I wasn't cold. I wasn't cruel. I was simply unavailable to be managed. As I left, she didn't follow. She stayed where she was, recalculating in real time. For the first time since this began, she understood that this wasn't a standoff. It was an exit I had already completed. The collapse wasn't public in the way people imagine. There was no single moment where everything broke at once. It came in waves, each one quieter than the last, each one harder to stop. Emily lost momentum first. Projects stalled. Clients hesitated. The ease she once moved with was gone, replaced by overcorrection. She followed up too quickly. She explained too much. People felt it and stepped back, not out of judgment, but self-preservation. Uncertainty spreads faster than blame. Jack unraveled differently. The bar stayed open, but the energy around it thinned to routine. Fewer familiar faces. More empty pauses between conversations. The charm that once covered gaps couldn't compensate for the strain underneath. He started blaming timing, then luck, then other people. None of it landed. I watched none of this directly. My life had narrowed in the best way. Fewer variables. Clearer lines. I took on work that required travel without coordinating schedules. I invested in things that didn't ask for validation. I slept without checking my phone. Emily reached out less often now. When she did, the messages weren't strategic anymore. They weren't framed. They came late, uneven, written by someone reacting instead of managing. She mentioned memories out of context. Small things she'd dismissed before. How I used to wait when she ran late. How I remembered names she forgot. How I handled pressure without making it her problem. Those details surfaced because everything else had fallen away. The circle that once amplified her presence had gone quiet around her. Not hostile, just absent. Invitations stopped arriving. Group chats slowed, then went dormant. The structure she used to move through people dissolved without ceremony. One evening, I heard she'd asked about me at a gathering I didn't attend. Not where I was. Not what I was doing. Whether anyone had seen me lately. No one had. That question lingered longer than she expected. By the time she understood what she'd lost, there was nothing left to negotiate against. No leverage. No audience. No urgency on my side. Just distance that had hardened into reality. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel regret. What I felt was clean. Her world had collapsed inward, not because I pushed it, but because I'd removed the part of it that held everything steady without demanding credit. And now she was standing in the quiet, finally seeing the shape of what had been there all along. She found me when there was nothing left to buffer the moment. No friends to soften it. No schedule to hide behind. Just the space between us, quiet and unclaimed. She didn't lead with explanations this time. There was nothing left to manage. She looked smaller, not physically, but structurally. Like someone standing in a room after the furniture's been removed, realizing how much they leaned on it. She told me she understood now. Not in the way people say it to end a conversation, but in the way they say it when they've replayed everything too many times and finally run out of alternatives. She said she hadn't seen the cost because it hadn't arrived all at once. She said she thought control meant safety. I listened. I always did. The difference was that I didn't absorb it anymore. She asked whether there was any chance to start over. Not to go back. To build something new. She didn't promise anything. She didn't bargain. She just asked, quietly, like someone who knows the answer might be no. I told her I believed her. That part mattered. I told her understanding changes things, but it doesn't reverse them. I told her I had already stepped into a life that didn't require me to be negotiated into place. She waited, hoping there was more. I said the only rule I live by now is simple. I don't stay where respect has to be relearned through loss. I don't re-enter rooms that only go quiet after I leave. There were no tears. No raised voices. Just the sound of something settling into its final position. She nodded once, slow, like she was committing it to memory. Not to argue with later. To carry. I stood up. I didn't rush. I didn't linger. I didn't look back to see how she took it. I'd already given her more clarity than most people ever get. Outside, the air felt unclaimed. Not empty. Open. I didn't disappear from the world. I just stopped showing up where my value had been treated like a setting instead of a constant. And this time, I didn't leave to be missed. I left to stay intact. Drop it in the comments. Hit subscribe. This is where we talk about what doesn't get forgiven.